Okay, Brian Miller-Hicks here, my continuing series of Earth Science Geology PowerPoint narrations. We're going to be tackling streams, rivers, and lakes. So, surface water. Surface water, fresh water is obviously extremely important, actually critical to our survival. Streams, rivers especially, and lakes as well, have served as transportation corridors, trading routes, source of fresh water, of course, and sadly also sites of conflict where many battles have been fought on rivers and lakes. They're obviously critically important geologic and geographical phenomena for our survival. So when we talk about streams, rivers, and lakes, again, we're talking about fresh water. And fresh water as part of the hydrologic cycle, which we'll explain here. So the hydrologic cycle has to do with the circulation of water on this planet. Global water distribution, as you can see from this graphic, fresh water is only some 2.8% of total water on the planet. So seawater, salt water in the oceans is 97% of total global water. Only 2.8% is fresh water. So you can see right there how critical it is that we protect our freshwater sources and that we don't pollute that fresh water, we don't waste it, we don't let it evaporate or get contaminated in any fashion. Mind you, 2.8% of global water is still a lot of water, okay? Of the fresh water, a small percentage is freshwater lakes. The soil moisture is, again, a small percentage, atmosphere as well, stream channels. Everything you see on this list make up this thin little light blue slice of fresh water. And as you can see, most of our fresh water is locked up in ice, in glaciers, ice caps, Greenland, Antarctica, mountain glaciers, valley glaciers, and so forth. So that water is locked up in ice, but as you know, as you've been hearing a lot of lately, climate change is a real thing. Many of our glaciers are rapidly melting. There are significant changes taking place in weather and climate, especially in the Arctic region. So a lot of that ice is melting. Yeah, it's giving us more fresh water, but it's also giving us flooding. It's also giving us water that passes from ice straight into the sea, so we lose that water as a resource. The other big slice of the pie, of the freshwater pie, is groundwater. Groundwater is that water that's held underground, not necessarily as underground rivers, although there are cases of that in cavern systems, but mostly held within the pores or the void spaces between soil grains, mineral grains, rock particles, and so forth. That groundwater resource is significantly important to many around the world. There are many, I would say billions of people that cannot rely on municipal water distribution systems. They can't go in their bathroom or kitchen, turn on a tap, and get fresh water. They have to dig wells and mine water that comes into the well as their freshwater source. A lot of this entails some hard work hauling water back and forth. If there's not a nearby freshwater stream or lake, then they have to go with water in wells, tapping our groundwater resource. So here's a picture of the hydrologic cycle, simplified, of course. Let's start with rainfall. Okay, we get precipitation or snowfall moisture coming from the sky, falls on land. A lot of this water just runs off back into the ocean. Some of it collects into lakes where it evaporates. Some of it evaporates. Some of it collects, of course, in river valleys where it again flows eventually to the ocean unless it's dammed up and feeds our reservoirs. Out in the ocean, the main source of our global water, it rains on the ocean as well, of course. It also evaporates from the ocean. The evaporation of water from land and sea, as water vapor rises up into the atmosphere and cools, condenses and forms clouds, and then rains back down. So that's a major part of the hydrologic cycle. And of course, as I mentioned, there's groundwater. Groundwater is fed by infiltration of rainwater directly through soil and rock below the surface of the earth, or it infiltrates from lakes, or it infiltrates from rivers. So we have precipitation as a gain of water. We have evaporation and transpiration. Transpiration is the release of water from plants and trees through their photosynthetic cycle. And we have infiltration of water into the ground and evaporation from oceans, lakes, and rivers. Okay. So let's look at rivers and streams. Rivers and streams are almost like living things. They're dynamic. They're constantly moving. They're cutting and shaping landscapes. They cut in one place or erode in one place, deposit in another place. They can be raging, steep, mighty rivers with waterfalls in mountainous areas, or they can be gently flowing, slow-moving, flat-lying rivers like the Mississippi River through the lower part of our continental United States. So there's a lot to know and a lot to see and a lot to observe as far as river dynamics goes. Let's start with the concept of capacity and competence. In a given river, the capacity of a river is the total amount of sediment carried. Now, important to know that a river does not just carry water in its channel. It also carries sediment, sand, silt, and clay, and dissolved mineral material. Okay, it's an important transporter of sediment. As it cuts away in one place, it'll carry that sediment downstream, deposit it somewhere else. Competence of a river or stream is the largest particle of sediment that can be carried by a river. So a very narrow, shallow stream can maybe carry only silt and clay. A very large, very energetic, very steep gradient mountain stream can actually move boulders, especially during times of high rainfall. Okay, competence is the biggest particle of sediment carried by a river. Capacity is the total amount of sediment carried. So here's a mountain stream. It has high velocity, small cross-sectional area, because this is only, I don't know, 12 feet maybe. High discharge. Discharge is the amount of water that passes through a given cross-section over an instant of time. Okay, so because a mountain stream has a steep gradient as it's descending from the mountain, it's got a fairly steep channel. That's why it has a high velocity. The steeper the channel is, the higher the velocity the water is going to flow at. So a mountain stream has high capacity because it can transport large particles like these boulders. High competence. It can carry large boulders, excuse me. Low capacity because it doesn't carry as total volume all that much stuff. Okay. Again, here's a very steep gradient, high mountain stream or river, Yellowstone River. Wyoming. And the steepest channel of all, of course, would be a section of river channel that we call a waterfall, where the channel can be nearly vertical and water velocity is very, very fast. So water being what it is, very mobile, of course, very low viscosity, fast flowing. It's got a lot of power to it. So a rushing, charging, rapidly flowing stream or waterfall has the ability to erode a lot of material, to cut away at the landscape. So what this waterfall is doing is it's gouging out material at the bottom and then shoving it downstream in this rapidly flowing current. Very energetic stream signal. By contrast, this is a section of the Mississippi River near its mouth, near New Orleans area. Low velocity, because the channel gradient or the slope is almost flat. So it's a slow flowing water. But it has a large cross-sectional area. In some places, Mississippi River channel is a mile or more across. High discharge, which means high volume of water being discharged through a given cross-section. So the Mississippi River has low competence, but high capacity, because the total volume of water is quite great, but the competence is low because you're not going to see big boulders rolling down the Mississippi River, right? So a river like the Mississippi River with very slow flowing water, low channel gradient, almost flat slope, almost flat gradient, has an appearance that we call a meandering river, which means it bends, it bends, it bends, it loops, and it flows in this manner because when you have a mountain stream, most of the energy is downwards, vertical. So the channel of a mountain stream is typically V-shaped, okay? V-shaped. But in a meandering river, the channel is more U-shaped with a broad bottom and less high size to the channel. In a meandering river, much of the energy is expended sideways as the river looks for the most efficient way to go from point A upstream to point B downstream. It will follow meanders as it gradually descends down this almost flat surface. And what a meandering river can do is on the outside of bends, like here, it will erode and cut away material. And on the inside of bends, like right here, it will deposit materials. I'll get more into that later. It has to do with stream and water velocity. So the typical parts of a meandering river would be the channel itself that carries the water, the bank, stream bank, which is the interface between the channel and the floodplain. Floodplain is called the floodplain because during times of high water or high rainfall, the water can come out of the channel and flood over the floodplain area. So we've been talking about stream dynamics. We mentioned velocity, we mentioned channel gradient, we mentioned channel cross-section. How do you actually assess or judge the volume of stream flow in a given channel? Well, you can actually measure it. You can measure stream flow and discharge. This is a gauging station across a small stream. This has been done and it is still being done by the U.S. Geological Survey. They measure stream current, stream velocity, generates a lot of data, a lot of information on how our streams and rivers behave during dry times, during wet times, and everything in between. So one of the instruments the USGS uses is a current meter, measures stream velocity. This fish is lowered into the stream, and so is this part of the instrument. As the water takes hold of these cups and spins them around, it gives the operator a measure of stream velocity or water speed, water velocity. This is like a weather vane, so it'll shift with the direction of current. And this, of course, is to take this instrument all the way down to the bottom of the channel. So we get a measure of how deep the channel is, how fast the water is flowing, and we can also do regular ground surveys across a channel to look at the cross-sectional shape of a channel. So what I mean by cross-section is illustrated here. This is a cross-section. This is cutting across the channel, showing the shape of the channel, showing the area of maximum velocity in the middle of the stream typically. It's called a thalweg, T-H-A-L-W-E-G. Now the velocity of the water is less on the sides and on the bottom. Why is that? Why would the water slow down on the sides of the channel and on the bottom of the channel? Basically, it's because of friction. Water moving over a surface will slow down because there's friction generated between the rock and soil particles in the water, whereas in the middle it's just a slippery slipstream. It can attain maximum velocity. So when we're talking about discharge, we're talking about the volume of water, for example, that would flow through this cross-sectional area and within a given amount of time. So that's typically given in cubic feet per second. Sometimes in very huge rivers, it's cubic miles per day, something like that. Okay? So that's basic river dynamics. Let's talk about river basins. So we're going to expand our point of view to look at not just individual streams, but many hundreds or even thousands of streams which make up a river basin. These are also called watersheds or drainage areas. As you might imagine, since we have some very big river systems on this planet, that's a lot of water that's being dumped into the ocean by rivers. But number one, biggest river in the world is, of course, the Amazon River in Brazil. It is composed, or maybe thousands of streams feed into the main channel of the Amazon River. In terms of discharge, it discharges over 7 million cubic feet per year. That's a lot of water. The Mississippi River is very large, but it's still only number 7 down here. Discharges about 611,000 cubic feet per year. Okay, so physically, this is what a river basin or a watershed or a discharge area looks like. So we have the Amazon basin. This is the main trunk of the Amazon River, being fed by many hundreds, if not thousands, of streams, rivers, creeks, etc., all feeding into the main current, which goes out to the Atlantic Ocean. As you can see, this is one example of a river being a huge influence culturally, historically, to the peoples that live in the area. The many native tribes live in the Amazon basin and rely on the Amazon River for fresh water, for the proliferation of wildlife and plant life. The Amazon River, of course, is used by modern societies for transportation, trading, and so forth. Here in the U.S., we have the famous Mississippi River, fed by the also quite large Missouri River, and everything in the Mississippi River channel ends up eventually in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Louisiana. let's look at river morphology, which means shape. So let's look at the physical characteristics of a river from top to bottom. When you talk about a river, you talk about a moving stream of water that has physical characteristics, including a gradient. A gradient is a slope. So if you look at this graphic, you see that this blue line represents the gradient of a river, and that gradient changes as you go from the higher elevations to the lower elevations. The lowest elevation is sea level. A river cannot get any lower than sea level. So this part of the river, which is very steep gradient, descends quite rapidly, relatively speaking. This is a section that is actively eroding rock, soil, cutting it away, biting into it, chewing into boulders, removing sand, silt, clay, and then transporting it through this middle section. So this middle section is a transportation section, the erosion section. And finally, as the river flattens out almost to a level gradient, that's where it dumps its load of sediment. A river can carry sediment only if it has enough energy to carry that sediment. A very fast-moving stream can carry a lot of large materials, boulders, cobbles, etc. But as the gradient flattens out, it loses velocity, it loses energy, it can't carry the big stuff anymore, so the big stuff starts to drop out first, and then the finer materials eventually dumped as well in the flattest, most distant part of the gradient. Okay, so coarse material comes out first, then finer, 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 and the finest as you get to the ocean. So this is a depiction, this is a gradient of the Kings River, actually, that comes out of the Sierra Nevada here in California. Starts out in mountainous terrain with a very steep, high-energy erosive gradient cutting into the material, transports this material all the way through the middle section. Then as it reaches the San Joaquin Valley, which is pretty flat, it starts to dump material. That is extremely critical for agriculture, as you might imagine. The stuff that the river brings out of the mountain will be deposited in valley areas and make for fertile farmland, or bottomland as sometimes term is used. Just to reiterate, so the steep gradient section of the river is in the mountains, high energy, lots of power, lots of speed. Then as it gets down slope, down gradient, it turns into a meandering, slower, but very high discharge, very high capacity river, bringing a lot of sediment down. And you can see from the color, it's kind of a muddy brown. It's because it's carrying mud. Okay, here's that picture again with the meandering river. And let's take a closer look at what I mentioned before, erosion and deposition. So a meandering river, as I said, expends its energy side to side. So the meandering river channel, the water flows on the outside of a bend and it erodes away material. And then as it comes to the inside of the bend, it'll deposit material. Well, why is that? Well, because water on the outside of a bend has more distance to travel than water on the inside of a bend, it has to flow faster to keep up. Okay, so because it flows faster, it's got higher energy and has more power to erode material. But water here on the inside of a bend doesn't have to flow as fast because it doesn't have as much distance to travel relative to water on the outside of the bend. So it can start, it'll slow down and it'll start dropping out material because it doesn't have as much energy. So it'll drop out silt and sand and even gravel and build up a depositional feature that we call a point bar, sandbar, gravel bar. Okay. Maximum velocity, of course, is in the center of the channel. This is a special feature that you'll see in meandering rivers like the Mississippi or the Missouri or other very large rivers. It's called an oxbow lake. Let's take a look at this graphic. Going from the top, here's a meandering river meandering away. See this loop here. Through time, and this is important to realize, that rivers change in shape, location, appearance through time. So if you're using a river, say, as a boundary between two states or two countries even, that boundary is going to change because the river changes. So here's that loop. You'll notice this space in here, right here, is narrower than this space in here. So it becomes even narrower to where this part of the channel and this part of the channel actually meet. When that happens, the water flowing downstream and says, oh, hey, here's a new route for me to follow. It's shorter. I don't have to spend as much energy going around this big old loop. So I think I'll just cut through right here. So it cuts through, takes the easier, more efficient route, and that has the effect of eventually building a new channel configuration through here, and that cuts off this loop. The loop gets cut off. It's not getting any active flowing water. It then becomes a lake. The lake gradually fills up with silt, sediment through time, and the oxbow lake can become just a scar full of material, full of depositional sediment that we call a meander scar. Another feature of rivers is that not only do they cut side to side, cut and deposit, but they also go up and down in elevation. That's in response to changes in base level, which I'll explain in a few minutes. But these are terraces, stream terraces. They are left by the activity of the river as it used to be. So right now, the river is flowing down here in this channel. But in times past, the river used to flow at this elevation, and then through time and down cutting and the adjustment of the gradient, it's cut down through this level and left higher banks that we call stream terraces. So these are actual representations of the level at which the river used to be, over here, and now it's down here. Special kind of river channel that we see only in certain areas is called a braided river channel. A braided river channel occurs where so much sediment is being dumped into the stream river system that one channel can't handle it all. The river wants to keep flowing, right? But it can't just remove all the sediment just with one channel. So the river, being the smart entity that it is, breaks up into many hundreds of channels. That way each individual channel can transport some amount of sediment. And you'll see these braided river channels full of sand and gravel in areas like Alaska, where glaciers are dumping huge amounts of sediment into river systems, or where perhaps a landslide or a series of landslides is dumped into river valleys and the river has to move a lot of sediment out. So these are what you might call sediment-choked river channels, and the river is doing its best to move that sediment out by splitting up into many channels. Okay, we're going to tackle a concept that we call base level. This has to do with changes in the gradient of a river. So let's look at this graphic. Here's the ocean, or the sea. It's known as ultimate base level because a river can't flow under the ocean. Once it reaches the ocean, it stops and dumps everything it has into the ocean. So a river is trying to do the least amount of work, but it has to do a lot of work to get there. This is what I mean. A river will try to get to that base level. That's its goal. So if anything's in the way, it's going to cut through it. So let's look at this river flowing in this high elevation plain or plateau. Now it's got a base level here that it's responding to, and it wants to get down to this base level. So what does it do? It starts cutting through this rock ridge or rock ledge. It's a waterfall. As the river dives over this cliff, it's cutting down through this cliff and incising its channel through the rock to get to this stage where now it's cut all the way through that rock and reach that same base level that you see here, that elevation. But it's not done yet. It still wants to get down to this base level, the sea level, 0. So it'll continue to downcut and downcut through this so that its profile is about as smooth as it can get. That's a river's goal, is to smooth out its own gradient and profile so that it's expending the least amount of energy and happily flowing down towards base level. Now base levels can change. Okay. Sea level, of course, can change. Tides can affect sea level, so there's a short-term base level change there. Through time, sea level can drop or rise. We know that during times of maximum glaciation, some 10,000 plus years ago, sea level was much, much lower, hundreds of meters lower than it is today, because all that water, so much water was locked up in ice that sea levels were much lower. That meant that streams back then were cutting actively to meet that much lower base level. And that's why we have canyons that have been carved out during glacial times, because there's so much rain. Because of the cooler climate, there was a much lower base level. Streams were actively cutting down. So that's one example of base levels changing through natural phenomena like glaciation. Base levels can also be changed by local phenomena such as landslides or lava flows coming into a lake, for example. If a river is draining into a lake, there can be local limited changes in base levels. There can be artificial changes in base levels as well. So the thing to remember is that if base level drops, then the river downcuts. If base level rises, then the river deposits, because now it has a new base level, and once the river reaches here, it's not downcutting, it's depositing. So we have a dam that's been built, we have a reservoir or a lake behind the dam, a new base level, which is higher than this base level. So instead of cutting to get all the way down to here, it's now only has to reach to this base level, and as a consequence, the stream velocity decreases and it starts depositing material. And that's one of the problems we have with reservoirs, actually, is rivers continue to dump material into the reservoirs in order to keep these reservoirs open and full of water. Sometimes we have to dredge material out. Okay. The various landforms that are associated with rivers and streams, some of the most interesting, of course, are deltas. Deltas are the intersectional sort of transition zone between river systems and whatever base level they're flowing into. In this case, the Nile River base level is the Mediterranean Sea, and as the river comes towards the sea, it's got a pretty flat gradient. It's got a lot of sediment, So it splits up into many, many channels, and it deposits material out into the Mediterranean Sea. And that material that's deposited at the intersection of river and ocean, or river and lake, is called a delta, because it's shaped like the Greek letter delta, which is sort of like a triangle shape, as you can see here. Here's a photograph of the Nile Delta right in here. Very classic delta-shaped delta, if you will. And of course, as we know, the Nile River is, I believe, the longest river on this planet. And it was, as I said at the beginning, crucially important to civilization, to the development of the very fascinating ancient Egyptian culture. That people back then relied on the Nile River's flooding every year to continually deposit new layers of fertile soil. Here's a different type of delta, if you will. Now remember when I said a lot of rivers flow into the ocean? Well, not all rivers and streams ever reach the ocean. Some rivers and streams dump into interior basins, such as into desert areas. And as you look at this stream coming down this steep mountain canyon in a desert, it slows down, and as it slows down, it dumps its material not into a lake or ocean or sea, it dumps onto the base level of the desert floor in this case. So up here you get the coarser material being dumped out first, because as the stream loses energy, it dumps the biggest stuff out first, and then finer and finer as you go towards the far or distal end of the fan, towards where this apron of material out here is the finer stuff, the silts and the clays. Okay. Another type of delta that's sort of peculiar looking is a bird's foot delta. So-called a bird's foot delta because if you look at this, it looks like the splayed out toes of a duck or a goose, some kind of bird, with various channels radiating out. Now, the Mississippi Delta is a very, very, very dynamic river system area, and it has historically been very active. It dates back to Pleistocene times, glaciation, when many of the glaciers carved the topography of our continental U.S. and fed this giant river system that we now know it as the Mississippi River. Through time, the delta has changed, and it hasn't always been here in this location. So if you look at these individual numbers, starting with number 1, this is the oldest representation of the location of the Mississippi River Delta on this picture. It was over here. Then it switched over to here. Then it swung down to here, number 3. Then it swung over to here, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7. What causes the switching back and forth? Well, it has to do with sediment load, it has to do with stream velocity, it has to do with the history of storms, hurricanes in the Gulf area, as well as large storms in the upper Mississippi, feeding waters and flooding that eventually made their way down towards the Gulf. So again, a dynamic system, very lively river system that goes back and forth and moves material around to a great extent at its mouth. As a river comes out to a sea or a gulf or an ocean or a lake, that point of entrance is called a mouth. Okay, the top of the river where it originates is called the head. Let's talk about flooding. I've already mentioned that rivers can overtop their banks because of intense rainfall. So some of you may have experienced flooding. Some of you may have driven through flooded streets. Some of you may have waded through floods if you've lived in the upper Midwest or the central states where they get a lot of flooding. We can get flooding here in Southern California as well. We occasionally have very intense rainstorms, which can block up our drainage systems and cause flooding in streets, cause flooding in buildings. We're not immune to that kind of thing. Deserts are known as dry places overall, but deserts can have some fairly significant storms and floods occur in them that come on suddenly and dissipate suddenly, but can still cause damage. So here's the anatomy of a stream flood. You see here the river in normal flow, meandering river with its loops. As more water comes into the channel from rainfall, it'll flood. That means the river gets bigger, it gets deeper, it gets wider. And we have the construction of what we call levees. A levee is like a bank. So let's look at this river as it's being flooded, coming over the banks, depositing sediment, coarse sediments near the channel, finer sediments out away from the channel. So it builds up these natural banks. That means the river channel is now deeper than it used to be. So the next time it floods, maybe it doesn't get all the way to the top because we've built up these banks. But the next time it floods, it even overtops those levees and builds new levees. So sort of a self-correcting mechanism. As a river floods, it builds up banks that confines its own channel. And in the Mississippi River, among other streams and rivers here in the States, we have built artificial levees to try to keep floodwaters out, to try to keep floods from going into farms and residences and business districts. That is often successful, but not always. Sometimes the flow in the river is so great that it busts through our artificial levees and causes flooding. Keep in mind that when you build levees, you're confining water in the channel. Then the water in the channel starts flowing faster because there's a larger volume in a narrower space. And so it has a lot of energy and can break through those concrete barriers or those dirt barriers or whatever they are and cause flooding. And because the river has all this pent-up energy, flooding of that type can be very damaging. Here's the Mississippi River in 1993, summer of 1993. There was long sustained periods of intense rainfall in the upper Mississippi states. So that built up a lot of water discharge in the north part of our country, and that slug or pulse of water gradually moved downstream, filling up channels on the way to where the Mississippi River overtopped its banks and flooded huge areas, busted through levees, and caused a lot of damage. Sometimes the flooding and damage, of course, can be fatal. One famous example is the Johnstown flood in 1889, which, as you can see here, is extremely destructive. And sometimes even rescue personnel need to be rescued. This is actually in Las Vegas, which is now, in this picture, is experiencing flooding due to intense thunderstorms, desert outbursts of rain, heavy precipitation, and the drainage systems in cities like Las Vegas may not be designed to handle huge inflows of water. So you get situations like this where fire and rescue is out there trying to rescue people, but they get stuck themselves and they have to be rescued by rescuers. Okay, that's it about rivers.